Limerence is an intense romantic infatuation that can feel fantastic at first, but it can also transform into an exhausting addiction that feels impossible to escape. When limerence has become an obsession, a natural question to ask is, how long is this going to last? Well, the truthful answer, of course, is it depends, but that's not very helpful. Asking Limerence in the community at livingwithlimerence.com gives a range from a few weeks to over 50 years. Also not very helpful. So, in this video, I'm going to describe the factors that affect how long an episode of limerence lasts and what you can do to accelerate recovery if you've already had enough. Hi, my name is Tom Bellamy. I'm a neuroscientist and a writer, and I'm the author of the book Smitten that explains how neuroscience can help us make sense of limerence and how to recover from it. Okay, let's get into how long limerence lasts. The usual estimate for how long limerence lasts is between 18 months and about 3 years. Now that estimate comes from Dorothy Tenoff, who first defined the concept of limerence in her book Love and Limerence in the late 1970s. Now Tenoff argued that this makes sense because limerence is all about a desperate desire to form a pair bond, and the ultimate outcome of that pair bond could be the birth of a child, and children are very vulnerable and need support in the earliest phase of life. So she surmised that limerence lasting about 1 to 3 years until the child was toddling suited evolution very nicely. But that estimate came from surveying people who were going through limerence and trying to assess what the commonest experience was for people. Now that hides a lot of detail about what's going on in any individual case. There's going to be many personal circumstances that can prolong or shorten the time. So let's go through the scenarios that people self-report about their own limerence, from the fastest resolution to the slowest, and see if we can identify the key factors that are involved. Okay, so first, some limerents do report an abrupt end to their limerence episode, almost an off switch. So that can be caused by the limerent object doing something that's so objectionable that it overwhelms even a determined limerent's best efforts at idealization. So examples of this include things like a huge row with the limerent object that was so nasty that the limerent essentially couldn't forgive them, and it broke the limerence episode there and then. Another limerent reported hooking up with their limerent object, which would seem like it would be a wonderful thing, but the sex was so terrible that it actually snuffed out the flame completely. They were just incompatible. Another limerent admitted that their feelings faded very quickly when their limerent object got engaged. And so that kind of dreamy hope that had been sustaining their fantasy was finally killed off. Now, although their feelings didn't vanish completely, these shocks were enough to break the spell and shake those limerents out of that altered state of mind that defines limerence. So an off switch is possible, but it is very rare. More commonly, another quick way that limerence can end is if the limerent object is very clear about their lack of romantic interest. So if the limerent declares themselves early on, explains their feelings and receives a clear "no, I'm not interested" response, that removes hope and uncertainty pretty effectively, and it punctures the fantasy. Now, that doesn't always mean, of course, the end of longing. There will be emotional pain from that loss of hope and from the rejection, but it does remove ambiguity from the situation. So if that clear rejection happens fairly early on in the limerence episode, recovery tends to be quick. But if the limerence has already progressed into the fixation phase, then it will take longer for the limerence to get over the addiction and recover. A third scenario, a longer lasting scenario that's probably the origin of the 18 months estimate at the lower end of a typical duration, is in fact the opposite scenario to rejection. The limerent object in this case reciprocates and you're able to establish a relationship. So if you're single and the limerent object is single and you establish fairly early on that there's some chemistry between you romantically, then you're likely to be on the hot and fast track to limerence euphoria. Sadly, that delicious bliss doesn't last forever, because the removal of doubt also leads to the fading of limerence over time. And how quickly that happens depends on how secure the relationship is. So if, for example, your limerent object is a non-limerent, then mismatched expectations about what love is like and how relationships should develop could keep the uncertainty and doubt alive, and that can prolong the duration of the limerence. But if the relationship is generally secure and there aren't major incompatibilities, then limerence can fade gracefully into a longer term form of love, because the uncertainty has been resolved and hope has been realised. But it doesn't always fade gracefully. A final scenario to note is that even if both people are limerents, the limerence fire can cool at different rates. So one person can fall out of limerence before the other, and that can cause a bit of an emotional crisis in the other person. So that 18-month to 3-year period where limerence feelings are naturally resolving from mutual limerence can be quite a rocky patch in a relationship, as the individuals involved have to start reassessing things. So the limerence fireworks have passed. What does that mean for the future of the relationship? Okay, so those are the generally straightforward situations in which limerence doesn't generally outlast its welcome. But from here onwards, things get more painful. Limerence limbo is a term I use for an awful state of being trapped in romantic hope and uncertainty. It's kind of a state of indefinite tension and indecision. This is when a limerent has settled into a routine of waiting. So the fixations set in and they live a life of rumination, but caution, anxiety, inaction, like they're holding on to wait and see if things might somehow change for the better. Time drifts past in a state of daydreaming, regret, confusion, and a kind of free-floating promise of some delayed future that we hope is coming. People can lose years of their lives to this limbo state, and the way into it is through uncertainty. Uncertainty is what drives you into those later phases of limerence, the fixation and desperation phases. And that uncertainty can come from two sources, you or them. So starting with ourselves, the first way that limerence can be prolonged is through being indecisive, not taking action. So if you keep your cards close to your chest in the hope that you'll find the perfect moment to take action. Now this may be because you aren't confident about your chances, or maybe you just generally struggle with self-esteem, or maybe there are barriers in the way that mean that you can't honestly and openly declare your feelings. So barriers like them being married, or having a different sexuality to you, or some professional obligation, they act as an amplifier, because adversity makes you want the reward that's being kept from you with extra fervour. So you nurture that hope within you as a hidden desire, a utopian dream. The presence of barriers means that you can tell yourself a romantic story about your situation, an if-only story laced with possibility and uncertainty. Now, regardless of the underlying cause, keeping your limerence as a private burden is a surefire way of prolonging it, as all those emotions turn inwards into a habit of secret rumination. A second way that you can prolong limerence is by accepting the limbo state as a kind of consolation prize or second best outcome. So it might be futile, but it beats giving up all hope or breaking contact with your limerent object and resolving to move on. Because living in a fantasy is not so bad in the short term. It's a poor substitute for the real thing of actual reciprocation from your limerent object, but it's also far more predictable, controllable, and reliable than they are. You know what it's like. It's familiar and it's safe. So your hopes can live on in a state of perpetual promise of future potential. Doing something might ruin everything. Okay, so those are things that we can do to prolong limerence. What about things that they can do? Well, some limerent objects like to keep you hooked. They act in a way that seems designed to prolong the limerent reaction. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they cultivate just the right combination of hope and uncertainty in the limerent to start that roller coaster between elation and dejection that disorients you and scrambles your judgment. That can push a limerent into a cycle of endless rumination that makes their limerent object the central focus of their inner world. Now, the very worst of these kinds of limerent objects are people that give a short burst of very intimate attention early on that feels divine, but then it fades away to almost nothing. And just when the fixation and the intrusive thoughts have worn you down to the point that you're thinking finally you're going to give up and you start to believe that you can move on, the limerent object briefly pops back up with a message out of nowhere. So that kind of behavior keeps the limerence fire burning indefinitely. Just when the embers were beginning to cool off, along comes the limerent object like a pair of wheezy bellows and puffs you up a little bit so that they can bask in the warmth of your admiration. Now, alternatively, less narcissistically, another limerence prolonger is a limerent object who needs you. Okay, maybe they're not actually willing to commit to anything as conventional as an actual relationship because, their life is very complicated. But they need you. They really need you because they don't have anyone else in their life who's as stable and supportive as you are. But ultimately, whether it's for narcissistic supply or for practical support, the outcome is the same for you. A periodic rejuvenation of those limerent feelings that are never allowed to fully subside. Okay, finally, the worst case scenario for limerence limbo is an episode that goes on for years. The longest case I have ever heard of was from a man who fell into limerence for a high school sweetheart, and he essentially elevated her to the position of romantic perfection. So every year he got in touch with her for her birthday or for Christmas and stoked those emotional embers in himself. So through decades of life, living completely separate lives, he kept in touch, he kept the limerence for his perfect woman alive. And no one else could compare, of course. That idolization had lasted for at least 50 years at the time that he contacted me. So it's an extreme case to be sure, but many of us can spend long stretches of our adult lives in limerence limbo. It can last beyond individual limerent objects, it can last through marriages, it can last till we reach the autumn of our years. Sadly, that faint warmth of imagined love can seem like enough, but it doesn't compare to the real thing. So, are there any ways that we can speed things up? How long does limerence last? Well, it lasts as long as the conditions that sustain it last. And that depends on that combustible combination of their behavior and your behavior. However, the only thing that you can control is your own behavior. Limerence is happening in your head, and so your mindset is going to be the key to recovery. Your reaction to the experience of limerence is central to how long it lasts. Your mindset will determine the impact that it has on your life. If you want your limerence to end, think of it as a threat to an otherwise happy life and something that's holding you back from reaching your potential. Developing that clarity of purpose will put you on a fast track to recovery because it puts you in charge of managing the situation. Now, developing that recovery mindset is the first stage of getting over limerence. And for more information about that, check out this video on escaping from limerence, which gives you lots of tips about how to achieve it. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you'd like more, and I'll see you next time.